Hella official.
Sons by Honani K. Trask. Your grandmother said about your grandfather, I gave him 3 sons. Yesterday, a man told me to give him trust. Is trust like a son? Or less, not being generative, phallic, or immortal? Did she tell me about her giving in pride or warning? But I have no sons to give, no line of immortality. I am slyly reproductive. Ideas, books, history, politics, reproducing the rope of resistance for unborn generations. But sons are not so earthbound. They soar beyond somewhere, with a woman's trust in their fist. And I stay behind, weaving fine baskets of resilience to carry our daughters in.
Thank you so much for that, Jamaica. Hello, everyone. Welcome, welcome, welcome to this space, to this panel. Welcome to my house. Just as you all, thank you for welcoming us into your homes. My name is Tavae Samuelu. My pronouns are she, her. I have the honor, exhaustion, and privilege of being the Executive Director of Empowering Pacific Islander Communities, also known as EPIC. We are hosting this panel, this talanoa, this conversation in partnership with the National Asian Pacific American Women's Forum. The words that you heard that Jamaica so graciously read for us were a poem, an offering by Honani K. Trask called Sons. As we thought about how to ground this conversation, how to ground ourselves and open this space, we really wanted it to be a blessing from an elder, from an ancestor, to think about the words that we offer. And for myself, as I've been thinking more during this pandemic about prayer, about blessing, why we offer them up and what we do with them, that in our practices, that these blessings are about permission, about the ways that we ask for permission to be in space. Acknowledge that for myself, as many of you, if you're joining from the continent, you are on Turtle Island, that I'm specifically in Long Beach, California, where the original stewards of this land are the Tongva. And we offer this up and we say this and we name it really explicitly, the original stewards of this land in solidarity, in prayer with Indigenous folks, but also so that when empire falls, we know who to give this land back to. And so that our speakers will be offering their land acknowledgements as well. So this conversation that we're having, this big existential question almost around race, gender, and militarism, this is, you know, an unapologetically Pacific Islander space. And so we open in that way. We're structuring the conversation a bit differently. We also want to offer up some space because we have the brilliance of the mana wahine who are gathered here. And this is one of those days and those times I just think like, I cannot believe this is my job. I cannot believe it is my tautua surrounded by brilliance and get to sit really dreaming and scheming with some of the best co-conspirators that Oceania has to offer. And so I thank you all and our panelists for being gracious with their mana'o and their mana, but also you all who are joining and watching and tuning in, because in the most anti-capitalist of ways and the original currency of energy of our people, that the most valuable thing that you give to us is your time and your energy. So thank you. So as we state that, I have a couple of questions that are going to set this conversation, this discussion. I also want to welcome you all to share your questions, your comments, your mana'o as well, if you want to drop it. Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, whatever other social media thing that I'm actually not very good at, but please engage with us. You're part of this talanoa as well. It's also as we, you know, I don't want to take for granted or assume that everybody understands the term talanoa. So I love, you know, colloquially, it's to talk story. And I really love Pacific Islander scholars who have taught me that talanoa is about dialogue in order to reach equilibrium, acknowledging that in a lot of ways we walk around in the world imbalanced, maybe not pono and not in right relationship. So the hope is by being in talk story with each other that we get closer to pono, that we get closer to being in right relationship with each other and our environment and everything else that we share energy and space with. So I want to start off by asking this very, seminal Pacific Islander question: who is your name? So I want to start off with Carrie Ann, and then we will go to Dr. Jamaica, and then we'll round it out with Terisa. So Carrie Ann, please share with us, who is your name?
Hey, Hafaday, everyone. Guahusi Karian Napati Borha, Pamiling Kadaron Zandasu, Chimorodzu, Tatal Guahan Zan Saipan, Los Masakadzu Guini, Chichenyo Loni Land, aka Oakland. Yeah, I'm gonna leave it as that.
Thank you.
Aloha mai kākou o wau no o Jamaica he oli meli kalani o story o he kupa no ka aina o Pālolo ka ua lili hua ka makani wai o Ma'o. Ka kima na wala noho wau ma wahiwa o Ahu. My name is Jamaica Heoli Meli Kalani Osorio. I am a kupa, I don't know, a product in the least capital sense possible of Palolo Valley on the island of Oahu. But I am joining you folks today from my new extended family home in Wahiawa, and I'm super stoked to be in this virtual space with so many powerful wahine representing so many beautiful parts of our Moana Nui Akea.
Salofalava, wa'o Terisa Siagatonu, everyone. I'm also tuning in from unceded Ohlone territory here in the Bay Area. My parents are Silaulau and Uyesa Siagatonu. My father's family comes from the island of Samoa, or American Samoa, specifically the village of Asu. And then my mother's family is also from American Samoa, from the village of Tula. And I'm super hyped to be in this conversation with my sisters, to kick off API Heritage Month the only way I know how, which is to talk about the US military. Thank you.
Thanks, sis. So I love, right? I pose this question of who is your name, and I think the additional context for folks to know that in Samoan, Oelo Ingoa, the literal translation is who is your name? And we offer that question and we ask people to state their relations, especially as we dive into a conversation that is inherently going to be about power and privilege and accountability. And that when we state our relations, we tell people who we are most accountable to and who has shaped all of our understandings of power. So thank you all for offering that. So I want to jump right into it, right? As Terisa has noted, right, that how do we talk about API? How do we talk about heritage without really contending with the legacy of the US military in our islands, in our homes, in our lands, and our people? So I want to kick off and ask Terisa if you could start off with this question: what has militarism meant for your and our communities?
Yeah, thanks, sis. It's funny, when we got the set of questions that we were going to be talking about, and I got this question of what has militarism meant, I literally just put everything. It's meant everything. The military touches every aspect of Pacific Islander communities, every aspect of our islands, and every aspect of our collective future, whether you're Pacific Islander or not. But for me, it begins with my father. So my father was born and raised on American Samoa, and was enlisted in the US Army in 1974 when he was 20 years old. And I remember once we were driving in a car, and I just never knew what motivated him to enlist or join the Army. And I asked him on the drive, I was like, why did you want to join the military? And when he was telling me, he was walking me through this story of how he didn't intentionally mean to join the military. He was young. Military recruitment was booming at that time on the islands. And him and his friends came across an Army recruiter who kind of, called them over and asked them if they would be interested in taking this like physical fitness assessment, so to speak. And there was, there's this language barrier where my dad didn't speak English, neither did his friends, but was communicating in a way where him and his friends were going through the process of seeing if they would be physically fit to join what they would soon learn would be the US military. And my dad passed the test with flying colors. And immediately after, in some way, shape, or form, he then enlisted. He found himself enlisting into the U.S. military, so much so that he didn't even have time to go home, pack, and say goodbye to his parents, my grandparents. He was shipped off on a flight to Hawaii the next morning. And I sit with the reality of that because, you know, he then talked about how much pride he had in enlisting and serving this country for 20 years and retiring after 20 years. But that whole car ride, I was sitting with the reality that my father was exploited into joining the U.S. military. And I was so emotional and just kind of holding back my rage that of embarrassment of not knowing that about his story, the complexities of his pride and his patriotism being so deeply woven with the indoctrination of our people within the military's agenda, and just frustration. And from that actually just catapulted me into needing to know more about the colonization of specifically my island at first, of Samoa, and then of Oceania, because I realized they were all connected. I was like, oh, our island got messed up, like Guahan, Hawaii, like, and I learned it all. It was very self-educated. It was me just Googling things, because realizing like none of my classes are teaching this. There's no direct subjects that are just focusing on U.S. militarism in relations to Oceania. So I was just teaching myself. I was teaching myself why the Samoan Islands were split into two, why we have American Samoa and what used to be known as Western Samoa, but is now called the independent state of Samoa. And so much of it had to do with American Samoa's primary value to the U.S. as having a deep water port that was a strategic hotspot location for the U.S. military, primarily between us and Asia. And it made it so that I realized that this union between American Samoa's geographic and military worth to the U.S. and the island's deep financial dependence on the U.S. government due to U.S. imperialism made it so that the desire and power of the U.S. military have overwhelmed the desire and rights of my people, of many of our people, both here on the continent, in Oceania, and abroad. And so the militarism means everything to me in terms of my obsession with needing to know the truth about how deep-seated the military's influence, power over us is. And now my deep desire and commitment to demilitarization in this lifetime with what time I have left, with what precious time I have left. And so I'll pause there because I want to pass it on to my sisters to also share what it's meant for them.
Thank you, Terisa. And I think there's so much that you named there. And I always love the sort of micro level of bringing in the personal storytelling and even threading it throughout, right? Of naming all of the ways that like militarism became part of your genealogy in many ways without your consent, right? The ways that it is and how it's part of our ancestry. So thank you. Jamaica, do you want to take on that question next? What has militarism meant for your/our community?
Absolutely. So I, as predicted, agree with everything Terisa said, and I'm really glad that Terisa opened was the first to answer, or at least answer the question before me, because Terisa, of your personal experience in having a father who was enlisted in the U.S. military. I'm one of the few Hawaiians whose father was never enlisted in the U.S. military, but I know that this story, this mo'olelo that Terisa shares, resonates with so many people. In terms of what has militarism meant for my community, I mean, U.S. imperialism and militarism are the only reasons Hawaii was illegally overthrown and eventually absorbed into the United States. And so, like, a really important part of this question in Hawaii is, how do we reconcile our participation? There's many of us who participate in the U.S. military. How do we reconcile that with our larger calls and claims for sovereignty when that work is obviously completely antithetical to our liberation? And our experience is not really unique to any other person who's been violated by the U.S. military. It's destroyed our aina. from Ko'olave to Pohakuloa to Red Hill, where there are fuel tanks literally leaking into our aquifer currently. Like right now at this moment, there's fuel leaking into our water source. It's also, it's destroyed our relationships to each other. It's removed our ability to access sacred and important parts of our aina. But also in an economic sense, right? Terisa talked about Samoan dependence on the U.S. government specifically because of colonialism. Well, Hawaii has a very simple economy that is completely entangled between tourism and military. That is our entire economy, and that's the result of a lot of really strategic and poor decisions by haole businessmen so that they could make lots of money at the expense of our people. But what this also means is that we are highly, highly vulnerable, right, to ongoing decisions made by the U.S. military about whether or not they beef up their presence in Hawaii or they leave Hawaii. And this is where some of the battle within our own community comes when we're talking about demilitarization, because so many of our people are enlisted in the U.S. military. But you can also think of the flip side here, right? We have this huge, what is conceived as a housing shortage in Hawaii, which is really a landlord issue in Hawaii. There's no shortage of roofs in Hawaii. So much of our precious housing and aina is taken up by the U.S. military. 25% of the land on my island alone is U.S. military bases, places that we are told we no longer belong as Native people. And so when I think about at the root of all of this, and I think about Terisa's answer, and I think about the way that capitalism at the end of the day, at the beginning, middle, and end of the day, right, is about extraction and profit. And militarism is really the central facilitator of capitalism. Anywhere that I see capital destroying my people, my ocean, my comrades, the military, the U.S. military is at the center of that. And so, we can talk about the Northern Marianas and Guahan and Samoa and Hawaii as these really strategic military bases, right? I think the only place in the world with a higher percentage of military bases and personnel than Hawaii is Guahan. And all of this is about our deep water bays and all this stuff, and how we're halfway between Asia and the continental United States. But it's really wild to me the way that U.S. military desire has been able to completely remap an ocean, and in that completely transform everything about the way that we relate to each other, not just as Hawaiians to American settlers, but also as Hawaiians to Chamorros, and Hawaiians to Samoans, and Hawaiians to Papuans, and Chuukese people, all of that. The military is at the center of all of that violence. I'll leave it at that, because I could go on for days.
You dropped a lot, and I feel like that was a perfect segue and opening. Come on, Carrie Ann.
All right, I will concur with both what both Terisa and Jamaica both said. What's hella interesting, just listening to both of my sisters in here, their stories, is I think when it comes to militarization for myself and my home islands, right? It kind of crosses both, yeah. So my dad was actually drafted into the U.S. military during Vietnam. Prior to that, he was just a typical country boy, quote unquote, who worked on a farm on my grandpa's ranch, who went fishing right across the street in the ocean. But he got drafted, which is one of the conditions with the Organic Act, right? Is one of the conditions about us being a colony in Guahan is we don't get to necessarily vote. Now, we don't get to vote for the president, but the president can essentially draft us into the war. And so my dad got called in. He was only, I think, 21, 22 at the time, got drafted. And he ended up staying for his full 30 years because he met my mom not too long after, had me and my brothers, my older brothers, and kind of stayed. And, thinking about that and what I know, it was actually my dad, former military man, got up to an E9 sergeant major, which is pretty high considering he never went to college. But it was actually my dad who kind of flipped my script in terms of the way I viewed colonization, militarization. I had to do this project for my credential program. And my mentor professor at the time was like a second language learning thing. And she was all, English isn't your first language. So go find out and interview your fam and find out why is it I don't know how to speak Chamorro. And so I interviewed my dad and we were talking, and he was mentioning how the reason why he never taught me and my brothers our native tongue was because we grew up in military schools, or DODEA, Department of Defense schools, right? And all you learn is English. And so for them, for him and my mom, it was our way to succeed within schools. And he brought up during that interview, I distinctly remember, he brings up we have this celebration called Liberation Day. This is like how much militarization of our island there is in Guahan. Liberation Day is when the US, quote unquote, liberated our island from the Japanese, which is not liberation, right? My dad tells me this, and I remember him saying, you know what? The US never liberated Guahan. They never liberated Guam. Because when you go in and you liberate a country, you go in, you do what you need to do, and then you leave. The US never did that. They came in and they stayed and they occupied. And so it kind of had my wheels turning of like, okay, growing up, Liberation Day is huge back home. July 21st is when you have this full-on parade back home on Marine Corps Drive, if that doesn't tell you how much militarization is on Guahan, right? We have the main strip of our island that goes from north to south called Marine Corps Drive. And on that, all the branches of the military come out full force. And all of the villages come out and all of our people come out, right? And so with that, right, there are so many Chamorros who enlist into the military, right? Back home in the high schools, not only do they have like college days, but they have military recruitment days where the branches of the military come out and they recruit for the military. You can go to the University of Guam and get like a degree in automatically, I don't know what the name of it is entirely, but once you graduate from it, you become an officer. And I know students who have done that, who have gone specifically to go into that program, or even enlist right after high school, specifically for those benefits, right? Which is why many of our people join the military, because you get access to the commissary. The commissary, if folks don't know, is like a grocery store on base where, it's like Safeway, right? Or Lucky's, depending on where you're at. And it's hella cheaper than off base, hella cheaper. You have access to the exchange, which is like a Target. You have access to the gas station. So there's so many reasons why, people back home, our people join. It's out of necessity. It's out of need. So much so that, at least for Guahan, we Chamorros, we only make up 30% of our population, right? Because there's so many of our people outside by these military bases. I always tell people, if you ever want to find Chamorros, unfortunately, go look at a military base, and in the surrounding areas, you will find our people, whether they are living in the military base or they're living in the surrounding areas, or they've retired and they, again, live in the surrounding areas, right? Very similar to what Jamaica was saying about Hawaii, militarization has polluted our lands and is currently at this moment still doing it. We're still having this huge US military buildup that's happening. Has started in 2006. It's 2006 and it's still continuing to this day, right? 1/3 of our island is occupied by the US military. We have this northern aquifer lens, very similar to what Jamaica was saying, that the US military is trying to build like a multi-firing range complex. Lands have also been stolen, right? How it connects to what Terisa was saying in terms of all the different aspects of life. So many generations of Chamorros have been affected by militarization, whether it's enlistment, whether it's in pollution, or even land loss, right? My grandma, who was born and raised in a village called Sumai, it's down south. I had always known her to live and be raised in this village called Santa Rita, not realizing the original descendants of Santa Rita came from Sumai. Sumai is now where Big Navy is, where the naval station is on Guahan. The only time you can access Sumai is twice a year if you're lucky, and that is during All Souls Day, and then 2 on this Back to Sumai Day, where they invite people, locals, onto the base for one day for a few hours to go and visit loved ones who are buried in the cemetery that's there, and it's like a big celebration, you know. So there's so many aspects in terms of Guahan, very similar to Hawaii in many aspects. The ways in which particularly U.S. militarization and U.S. militarism has definitely affected our island, which gets sticky, right? Because you have aunties, uncles, mom, dad, all these different family members who are a part of the military. So to critique the military, people take it personal and like, oh, so you're talking about my auntie? Oh, so you're talking about my uncle? You know, and it ends up being sometimes even within families to have that discussion becomes really difficult and hard to have because there's so much connected to it, right? Not only family, but also economics, right? You have so many vets. And I think we were talking about this before, like Guahan and Samoa are like one of the #1 places for the US military, right? So it's so ingrained sometimes that it's so hard to like pull away and to see this bigger picture of how it truly affects us, right? What are those lasting effects that are going to be continuing on for generations to come, not just for us now in this present day or even before, but continuing forward. So I'll stop there.
Yes, all of the things, all of the things. Thank you so much for that, Carrie Ann. It's incredibly rich as all of your answers were in particular, right? I think the points that I'm lifting up, one, there's nothing pono about militarism. There's nothing that makes us in right relationship with anything with the presence of militarism. Two, I really love both Terisa and Carrie Ann, as you talked about your fathers, this piece of having deep compassion and empathy, even as our people are recruited into these systems. Like, how are we tender with each other and hard on systems? Like, very clear about not begrudging the ways that our people have been forced to survive under capitalism. And so, as I state that, I want to ask this question because you all had touched on it a little bit, right? That I think in a lot of your statements, you really made it clear why demilitarization is important. But I wonder, what are the alternatives then that we offer to our people? Like, what is demilitarization? And what are the alternatives that we're setting up for our people, right? Knowing that Pacific Islanders are 249% overrepresented in the military. So I want to start with you, Jamaica, and then we'll go to Terisa, and then we'll go to Carrie Ann.
I don't want to go first.
All right, cool. Tell somebody else.
I'll do it. Just being real difficult. Okay, so one of the ways that, and this is something that I've learned from indigenous, feminist, Pacific Islander scholars and activists. One of the ways that the Wahine in Hawaii, who are demil activists, talk about this is the need for genuine security, right? So when you talk about, in Hawaii in particular, when you talk about demilitarization, there are like 2 real first responses. The first is like, well, how are we going to survive economically, right? Or personally, like, oh, my dad serves in the military. Like, what's my dad going to do if there isn't a military for him to serve in? And then the other kind of immediate resistance people put up to the idea of demil is who's going to protect us? Who is going to keep us safe? Which is a great opening for us to talk about all the ways that the military has never kept us safe and never kept anyone safe, right? Also the police, but that's not today's conversation. So what does it mean to develop an alternative? Well, the alternative is to first talk about what genuine security might look like. What are our basic essential needs that need to be met for us to feel safe? Those are, really simply, right? Food security, housing security, feeling safe in your own home, right? Security in knowing that you're not going to be physically, mentally, or emotionally abused by someone in your household. We know that domestic violence takes place at at an alarming rate on military bases, right? And in military-involved families, we know that women are in a higher risk of violence, both sexual and physical, by military servicemen. So like that doesn't make me feel safe. That doesn't feel genuinely secure. So that, to me, that's the center of this question, right? In absence of the imagining of an alternative, we have to ask us really simple questions about what creates safety in our communities. When I think about who's doing this work, right, I think about people like Women's Voices, Women Speaks, which is a Hawaii-based organization primarily made up of Indigenous Wahine from the Pacific, but also like radical Pinais who are living in Hawaii. I think about the Hawaii Abolitionist Collective that is really the only thing people are more resistant to in Hawaii than demilitarization is abolishing the police. That's just a fact. The only thing that is harder to talk about than the military is the police. So the Hawaii Abolitionist Collective is doing huge work and at least just starting that conversation. And then I kind of zoom out and think about where have there been moments of genuine security, right? And these may not feel like alternatives to militarism because they look so unlike militarism. But that's the point, right? So I think about the Pu'uhonua at Pu'uhuluhulu, right? This place of refuge that we created in July of 2019 in an ongoing attempt to protect our sacred aina and to protect Mauna Awakea from further desecration. And I think about how so many of our essential basic needs were met by people, not by institutions, not by systems, but by people who stepped in to fulfill whatever skills they, like whatever kuleana their skills would allow them to, and who made that labor visible, right? So we think about how in the entire existence of the United States, or even, the state of Hawaii, much shorter history, neither one of these two institutions have ever been able to meet the basic needs of all their people, right? Never in the history of Hawaii has every single person had access to shelter and access to clean and healthy food and access to a quality, affordable, i.e. free education, access to healthcare. Well, at the Pu'uhonua o Pu'uhuluhulu, we met all of those needs for thousands of people in less than a week, right? So what this shows me is not just an alternative to US militarism, but it shows me that there is another way that we can live in community with each other. If we go back to the last question, we talk about what does militarism mean to us, to me it's at the center, it's a disruption of pilina, right? It's a disruption of the way that we relate and care for each other. It's a disruption of how we see each other as kin. So then the alternative is going to be not just to remove the military, and yes, we should remove the military, but it will also be reestablishing those relationships to each other and to our lands so that we can create communities that are safe. And so that we can, so then we can say things like we are secure and safe without lying out of our asses. So that's to me like just the beginnings of a conversation of, what demilitarization is, because some people think it's just simply deoccupation. But deoccupation is not the same thing as demilitarization, right? We could deoccupy Hawaii and 50% of those troops and resources could go straight to Guahan. That's not demilitarization, right? That's very simply just deoccupation. So we need to have a grander view of what that looks like. That's all.
That's all. But I love the light flex of we provided for thousands in a week with Hawaii in its occupation. Amazing. I love it. Okay, Terisa, your turn. Take us there, sis.
You know what? I forgot your question to vibe. I'm just going to vibe off of what Jam said because I was swept away. For many reasons, though, because one, I was on Mauna Kea. I was there for a few days, and I was a kumu for a day through the free education that was provided. And I use that example, that lived experience, all the time when I met and confronted with opposition around, well, what are we going to do to keep us safe? Well, what are we going to do to provide in these ways? And I use that easily as a way to reflect that Hawaiians have shown us a world like post-revolutionary world in which we're going to be okay because we were okay before the U.S. military got here, and I feel like we can get back to that in our lifetime or in a lifetime after us too. I also agree with Carrie Ann when she spoke about how this is the touchiest subject to talk about for me. This is the one I shy away from immediately all the time. I feel safe and agree to this because I'm talking with y'all. But do I always feel this bold and comfortable with my father? No. Do I always feel this way in our community? No. I walk slower. I'm just so conscious of how to language this, because also as an artist, as a poet, like I think part of my answer is here, where I have realized the importance of helping our people connect dots that just stem from their own stories. I don't think you need to be an expert on the US military or go to school for this to realize that there's discrepancies and contradictions all over the place with the military's worth, what we've been taught, and what we believe, right? And so I love, as an artist, helping to create spaces that help connect those dots. And nowhere have I ever felt more alive in doing that around this topic than when I was on American Samoa teaching writing workshops with our youth in their high schools. And I had that chance to go a few years ago, in which we went there in ways that the teachers were so stunned that we went there. But it was also illuminating for the teachers, for the schools, that these are topics that oftentimes our culture, I think it's out of a need of protection. I think part of Samoa is there's rigid parts of it that are very much, like if you're a young person, you can't speak up, you can't, you don't get to speak over your elders. There was something that gave me permission as an artist, as a visiting artist, that allowed our young people to go there in ways where when they went there, the teachers literally told me, like, I've never heard my students open up like that. I've never heard them talk about their struggles with anxiety, depression, suicide ideation like that. And so when I think of how vast this topic is and how sometimes it's overwhelming it is, I come back to, okay, well, what is my lane? What are my tools? What are my strengths? And a lot of it is through writing and through storytelling and through knowing that the power of storytelling is also in being able to create new narratives for us so that we don't have to rely on these old dominant ones that have been ruling our communities for so long. And the power of storytelling and narrative is that it creates the culture in which we make meaning of everything about our lives. And what I also know is that cultural change always precedes political change, that we can change hearts, minds, behaviors way faster, culturally speaking, than laws have ever changed, than policies have ever changed. The Constitution hasn't even changed in like centuries. That joint's been the same for a while. But we know that attitudes can shift, cultural shifts can create all kinds of new possibilities. And I also see it too. I think I'm living in a time where I'm seeing, Samoans identify as anti-imperialist. I'm like, what? Okay. Like I'm seeing language shifting and folks really coming for systems instead of for each other. And it's hard because it's not always the case, but you can't help but have hope. I can't help but have hope that my impact is in the culture keeping, is in the culture shifting. And I like the fact that utilizing art as a vehicle to getting there can help with that decolonial process, because a lot of it is also in the mind. I want my people to know that we're not free and that we can be free. I think prioritizing imagination and dreaming helps do that. So I'll keep doing that from here and supporting all the other efforts of DMIL folks that are out here, that have been out here. I think there's an organization called Genuine Security that have been out here for decades, ran by women, right? And so how do we keep connecting our struggles and coalition building so that we see who our target is, so that we're really clear on it. I'll pause there.
Thank you. I mean, you knew the question. You felt the question in your mana, and also blessings to you, because I know you're the one who taught me that just because it's cultural doesn't mean it's sacred. And I think that is also the ways that you all are also unsettling a lot of revisionist history and harmful narratives that exist in our communities about the military, and also the ways in which this notion of a warrior culture gets co-opted to recruit our folks for this world policing. But yes, Carrie Ann,
One
the
second.
question, right?
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Did y'all see that ridiculous commercial where like the indigenous Pacific people
No.
transform into the
No.
National Guard? I didn't even watch it. I just saw like the little preview because I don't have time to be more traumatized. But it pretty much just sums up everything y'all saying right now. So I'll try to find it. We can burn it. I don't know. Sorry. Sorry to interrupt.
No,
That's good.
yeah. I was like, oh, maybe the algorithm figured out I'm not the one and will not show me the commercial. But I feel it. Thank you. And the question was really around like, what are the alternatives we offer up around demilitarization? But take it whatever feels good, sis. Go for it.
So to answer Teresa, the group that you're talking about is Women for Genuine Security. So they've been around for a really long time, and they work with so many. And what's dope is it's women, right? And when we look at movements around the world, movements within our own home islands, like women are the ones, right? They're like that foundation, that rock that help to push things forward and help movements move. So, but that's the group. Co-sign again, like it's so hard not to like co-sign everybody. Back home, the same two questions that get popped up in Hawaii are also the same questions that get popped up back home in Guahan, right? Is security, economic, and security in terms of somebody coming back in during like Japan time, right? Like with the Japanese occupation during World War II. That's always one of the biggest ones. Well, if they leave, what's going to happen to us, right? But I think one of the main, even was it 2016 when North Korea decided that they wanted to possibly shoot one of their missiles to Guahan, right? Yes, if the U.S. wasn't occupying, if they weren't here to protect us, what are we going to do? It's going to be Japan all over. We're going to end up like this whole other country. But in actuality, the U.S. being on our island and in our ocean only makes us a target. Like it makes it that much more real and dangerous. Like they don't protect nothing. They don't protect anything but their interests. They could care less about what it does to our island, what it does to our islands, our lands, right? Whether that's in Oceania or elsewhere in the world, right? Because it's not just Oceania. I know we're focusing on Oceania, but I just want to throw that out, right? Like it's international. U.S. imperialism, there's a reason why it's called that, right? And so when we look at back home, right, we import 90% of our food. There's so many things that are relied on tourism and militarism. Like it's the number one. It's so hard. But I think what's important to remember is we were self-sustaining before y'all came here. We can do it again. And there are moves back home of folks who are doing things to try to bring that back, right? In small different ways. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, but it's definitely been things in the works, both in terms of resistance and creating futures, right? In different ways in which it looks like. It's really interesting, and it's a really interesting time right now in Guahan in terms of people coming and awakening to the idea of demilitarization, of what it looks like to essentially make decisions for what things will look like for our people and for our homeland. And for those who also call Guahan home, right? You can't really talk about, sometimes demilitarization without talking, at least for Guahan, about decolonization, because the US and colonization is so deeply ingrained with the US military that you can't have really one conversation without the other, right? And even those conversations, right, get really difficult for folks back home. But there are so many different groups who are making and showing all these different ways. And like what Sis Terisa was talking about, would you say culture precedes political, right? Like there is definitely, like Chamorros are some of the most proudful people ever. Let me just say, I feel like all peoples that can be hella proudful for their own, peoples, islands, etc. Chamorros are hella proud, right? And to some extent, it's like tapping into that, like that knowledge that we have been having, but because of all of these different things have kind of made that cord, right, a little thinner, but it's still there, right? Or maybe kind of made that understanding and that vision that we have a little bit more blurrier, but it's about being able to tap in. Like our peoples are hella dope, resilient, strong, Chamorros, Kanakamolis, everyone, right? All throughout Oceania, like we've survived how many thousands of years? And I think it's part of demilitarizing as well is also just even just our thinking, the ways we are, the ways we be with each other and within ourselves, right? But yeah, like it's really, I like the idea of imagining what it could be, right? All the different ways that it can be. Because sometimes it's really easy to be one way and this is the only way. And sometimes it's hard for our peoples to imagine what that looks like. And so providing those different alternatives and those different ways of what could be is necessary, right? And unfortunately, we're not always going to learn it within the school systems because the school system's controlled. But we learn that through talking story with our elders, talking story with community, talking story with different folks. It's learning, it's going onto the land and growing something, you know what I mean? Going out into the ocean, learning how to navigate from some elders. It's all these different ways that people back home are slowly starting to do and have been doing, right? I think as of recently, within the last 10 years, it's definitely been more of a push, especially more so the discussion around demilitarization, right? Especially with some of the issues that are currently going on back home, particularly with our northern aquifer, right, which provides 80% of our water that the US military wants to build that firing range over, which is ultimately going to pollute, right? Similar to what is happening in Hawaii. And so people are starting to wake up and people are starting to understand. But again, the question comes is, what do we do for the family who is enlisted in the military? What does that look like? I have my own thoughts about what it looks like, but I also realize where I'm at currently, which is I'm not currently back home on the ground with my folks in terms of what the everyday struggle is, because the everyday struggle back home is very different to the struggle that's currently here that I deal with here on the continent in my space. And also, while I'm still connected to back home and still doing organizing with Independent Guahan back home, it's still a question that for me is one that I would like to have discussions with folks about, right? In terms of what does it really look like to demilitarize? What does it really look like to be independent, right? Yeah, so I'm gonna leave it there for that one.
Thank you. I want to leave it, Teresa or Jamaica, did you all want to respond to anything that Carrie Ann shared?
Thinking about how, I think it's really important with what you said, Carrie Ann, about how our vision and our ideas around this issue are shaped by where we currently are, right? It's both shaped by our ancestry and where we come from, but where we currently are. And I'm thinking about the way US militarism has placed us where we are, right? And like how, like, y'all are in the Bay, and I'm lucky enough to be living on my ancestral island, right? But how would this conversation be different if Carrie Ann, if you were in Guahan, and Teresa, if you were in Samoa, or if we were meeting in one of those places as our ancestors have done before, and reestablishing those routes and routes of connection. So I think that's another thing that is perhaps really obvious to a lot of us, but also really unspoken in terms of the impact of the US military.
Mm-hmm. And I think too, just to kind of add to that, I think that is really important. And it also kind of brings up this other piece, I feel, of diaspora blank, right? In terms of how can they contribute? How can they do anything? Because they're not back home. Some who, at least particularly I'll speak for Chamorros, right? Again, we only make up 30% of the population in our home island, right? We're essentially we are minorities in our own home island, right? And so you have more Chamorros here on the continent and elsewhere, right? A large part due to the military, but then how does that look like too for folks who are raised out here, who maybe have never been home, but also want to be involved in any kind of which way, have that awakening? I like to say they took the red pill, right? And now they're like woke and they got some stuff going on. But what does that also look like too for them and other folks, whether from wherever you come from, to be raised out in the diaspora?
Ooh, yeah. I'm just resonating and marinating over so many things that y'all are saying. I think there was something you were saying, Carrie Ann, that was reminding me of something I saw on Twitter. I'm always on Twitter. But around this notion of like when the movement to cancel student loan debt. And I remember folks connecting it to the military of like, if we cancel student loan debt, then what does the US get to hold over our head if they couldn't promise free education through the US military? And that part, right? and connecting it to climate change, like wherever the environmental activists are in the world, if they don't have a pulse on the Pacific, then they're not really talking about much, because that means they're not talking about the military, right? And so these are the kinds of dots that I'm always obsessing over. And then, yeah, when it comes to like, I resonate with like not being home on the ground doing this work. I've never been home in Samoa doing this work. I've always been like aching for wanting to be close to this in ways where I don't feel like an imposter or I don't feel like I'm disrespecting my people by having so many questions and whatnot. But I just can't help but think about how our enlistment in the U.S. military has even exceeded recruiters like expectations, like American Samoa's, like #1 in the world for enlisting the most people in the U.S. Army, like 2 years like in a row, and they didn't even expect it to be that, but they know that they stay on our islands because of that, and yet it also leaves the island in this contradicting predicament where its relationship with the U.S. has done little to alleviate the poverty that leaves American Samoa's young people few other economic options other than to ship them off to boot camp. And so it's like those kind of discrepancies where I'm like, I want my people to contend with what that means. Because it goes back to what Jamaica was saying of like these questions that we have about who will keep us safe, who will support us. It's like, but look what they're doing right now. Like, look look at the actual ramifications. Maybe not for your family. Maybe it's a lucrative experience for your personal family. But we're talking about the village, and we're a collectivist people. We take care of all of our people, right? And so we got to make these bigger, wider connections that pull away from frameworks of white supremacy and come back to indigenous knowledge that have always been innate to us. Yeah, that's all.
Just add what Jamaica said about all of us gathering within like in Samoa together in Hawaii, in Guahan. Yes, please. That would be hella dope. I'd be so down.
Yo,
like y'all
Hey,
come.
as
I'm just saying, like in 2 years, y'all can come to Guahan and y'all have a place to stay. Because then by that time, I will have my home built on my family land, which ain't too far from the ocean. So y'all have a place, and it'll be tight, and we can make that what Jamaica said a reality.
I'll be there. But here's the crazy thing, right? It's like this. That sounds like such a fresh and beautiful and original idea. Like, let's just go be in each other's territories and like face the darkest and deepest challengings of our lifetimes. But this is stuff that women in particular in the Pacific have been doing, for the last few generations, right? I think about people like Terisa Siagatonu, or I think about Aunty Terry Kiko'olani, and I think about Wani Keala Akaka, who, they all traveled the Pacific to meet with other Wahine of the Pacific to talk about militarism and to like do the work to keep us safe. So yeah, let's go. I'm there. I'll be there.
Word.
Sign me up.
I thought you were just gonna offer to like pick us up in the canoe, Jamaica. You're just
oh yeah. Okay, but see, like, sure, I'm really like basically a preschooler in the Hokulea community, but as soon as I have enough power to say, hey, I'm gonna pick up all my friends across the Pacific, we'll do it.
I love it. I think there's so much richness in what you all are offering. I know they told me, it's like, oh, we didn't actually put an end time on this panel, but I do realize we're coming up at the hour mark. The other piece is you all were sharing this notion of, and, I'm going to take some liberties and maybe ask if folks are good to go, maybe 10 minutes longer. As y'all were sharing about the notion of like gathering on each other's land with each other, there's also this piece of acknowledging the fact that we are having this conversation in English, right? That Carrie Ann had also noted earlier about military schools only teach you English, right? And I think I've even heard you, Jamaica, share of like what it means to be a second language learner, of like always starting in English and then translating into Olelo and the other piece. And Teresa, you and I have had so many conversations, right? Of like, when we think about Fa'asamo, the three pillars are land, language, and family. And so there's an aspect of when you don't have language, right? That's the other thing that militarization and colonization robs us of, is there's so many different words in our language that name these relationships with a great deal of sacredness. And so how does that also impact, right? Because I think about our ancestors too, who are all polyglots, right? I've met so many Wahine, like women in the Pacific who speak 6, 7, 8 languages, all of them Pacific languages, where no matter where they go, they're able to articulate with each other, right? And that they don't force people to translate their intuition, right? And that we know that when you get to speak in your language, like that's from your heart, right? That's from your na'au, your very core of how you connect, right? How you use language to connect when English can feel like separation. So, and I don't know if this is going to get closing, but I would love to hear from you all. I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this question around what does militarism mean for AAPI, right? That this month, Asian Pacific American Heritage Month, often a site of erasure, like the AAPI label for our communities, but militarism in particular plays a part in AAPI. So I'd love, Teresa, to start with you, and then we'll move through our panelists of like what does militarism and AAPI even mean?
Yeah. I think it was you, Tavae. We were in a space together where you were sharing how no, we weren't in a space. I was watching you do your thing in an interview, and I was like, dang, she said so many things. And I remember one thing that you said that sticks with me around AAPI is how AAPI tends to be race specific, but not anti-racist, and how you want to be in a community that is clear on being Indigenous led, clear on being pro-Black, clear on being pro-liberation, right? If we're going to be in communities together as AAPI. And that resonates with me because I've always believed that if you're going to be anti-racist, you have to be anti-imperialist. I don't think there's a separation in that. And so I think there are parts of this complex identity we share as AAPI that comes directly from colonialism, that comes directly from the fact that Asian countries like Japan have colonized some of our islands, not all of our islands, right? And there's something to be said about us not contending with that as a community every time this month comes around, or anytime API things are happening. It's always this notion of talking about more representation. How come we don't see people who look like us in Hollywood, so on and so forth? When I'm always like, when are we going to talk about settler colonialism? Like, when are we going to talk about US imperialism? When are we going to talk about empire? If we really are talking about being in genuine community with one another, right? And then on the other side of that is our people are in the military that are also in Asia. That's also impacting it that way as well. And the history of the Pacific being like a gas station of sorts to Asia. Like, there's just so much connection there that my hope moving forward is that AAPI spaces do more to really address what I know Jamaica has said in other spaces too, of this underlying current of colonialism that we oftentimes don't do together in community. Some of us do. Pacific Islanders do it a lot, but as an AAPI community, I think we can always do more around that. And we have to, if we really aim to be free and liberated, we have no other choice. This is part of our work, I believe. But I'll pause there.
Thank you. All right, we'll go to Carrie Ann, and then we'll close out with Jamaica around this question of what is AAPI and what does it mean around militarism?
I just co-sign with what Terisa said. I was gonna co-sign with what Terisa said. Uh, but I just want to bring it. I'm about to like go back and rewind it real quick. I just want to say when I brought up the whole idea about like diaspora and like particularly with what sis Teresa was talking about, like she ain't trying to like fake the funk or be an imposter, whatnot. I think it's really important for folks who are out here, if that's what you're interested in, connect with folks back home in the islands, learn, make connections to other folks here on the continent, wherever you stay. Um, because it's also important to make that connection as well. Like Sister Teresa is definitely not an imposter, right? Like she still has her connections. She's still rooted. At the end of the day, we all still rooted. Again, it's just making that connection. So I just want to put that disclaimer out there because I know it can get kind of touchy, at least for tomorrow's. It can get like a really touchy subject sometimes about like who can, who doesn't, and you da 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 da. So I just wanted to throw that out there because I kind of made the comment about what does that look like for a diaspora blank, right? Chamorros in particular. Like I always say, like everyone has a place in this work, right? Whether it's anti-militarism, anti-racist work, etc., anti-imperialist, we all have our different roles and they don't necessarily all look the same. Yes, of course, it's always good to be home on the ground, but also there are circumstances and reasons why we're not at home on the ground, which doesn't mean or take away from the fact of like you can't do any kind of work, you can't do any kind of building, you can't do any kind of education, right? In the smallest ways to like some huger, grander possibilities and ways, right? So I just wanted to throw that out there. But I co-sign with what Terisa said. I'm for sure gonna co-sign with what Jamaica's about to say because she's gonna drop it and she's gonna drop the mic and then walk off and then we're done. So moving on to you, sis. Jamaica, go ahead.
Well, that's a lot of pressure. Okay, this is what I want to say. The first thing is, I wouldn't have known that this was Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month if I didn't get an email asking me to have this conversation. So that's a way to like frame where I'm coming from into this conversation. AAPI spaces are not spaces that I've traditionally, historically been involved in unless I'm talking to folks from EPIC and they're doing something dope. Anyway, so I'm definitely speaking as like an outsider of that space. And that is also, you know, a result of the ways that Hawaiians and to a larger extent, Oceania has been erased out of AAPI. But when I think of AAPI, I think of something that only exists because of US militarism. Why else would we be framed in this way if not for US military intervention into the Pacific and, you know, into Asia and across the United States? I think about how a space where the second word is American is never going to be a space where I feel like there's going to be a lot of good work, like where all my best work is going to take place. I don't want personally to be building with folks who identify as Americans. As from a personal, like real honest place, I'm not an American, and if you're not ready to like take a step back and see what choosing to identify as an American, what you are taking with you, then there are only certain conversations you and I are going to be able to have with each other, right? It doesn't mean we're not going to talk, but it means there is a ceiling, and the ceiling, in my opinion, is pretty low. So I think about AAPI as a space that organizing needs to take place, but it's a for now space, and it is not the future space that I want to live in, and it is not the future kind of collectivity and solidarity that I want to build. It is, to me, not liberation, right? It's in the same way as, I won't go in that other direction. That's going to just lead somewhere bad. So I'm going to censor myself there for a bit. But then I also think about what you brought up, Tavae, in terms of language and how language is such a visible and intimate representation of this violence across our communities. You know, I think about, even if we're just talking about, you know, Hawaiians are very, very Hawaiian-centered, and then if we're not Hawaiian-centered, very Polynesian-centered. So this example is going to be very Polynesian-centric. But I think about just looking at Polynesia, right? And I think about the way that if I go to Tahiti, I can't understand anything anyone is saying, because it'll be a cold day in hell when I learn how to speak French. I have no desire to speak that another colonizer's language. But if they were speaking Tahitian, and some of them are, but when they speak Tahitian, at least there's understanding, because I speak my language, right? And so many of my people don't speak our language, so even then, they would not understand what people are saying in Tahiti, right? And I think about how our ability to even understand each other on the most basic sense has been robbed from us because of which military showed up on our shores and stole our land and decided to occupy. And so, you know, in what ways does militarism intersect with AAPI? Yes, as Terisa says, it means we have to talk about settler colonialism. It means we have to talk about the way Japan has done all kinds of colonizing bullshit across the Pacific, but also the way that Japanese and Chinese settlers in Hawaii are making billions of dollars off of the devastation of our land and Native people as Hawaiians. But it also is going to require us to reckon with a more Oiwi, a more indigenous, a more oceanic way to relate to each other. Because as much as we can do with AAPI, it's not the freedom destination that we're looking for. So there's more work to be done. And I'm excited to do that work with you guys.
Thank you so much. I think that's a good place to, if not close, pause our conversation, right? Because this is the other thing about Talanoa, that it could go on for hours, days, months, years, lifetimes, right? Where the next generation will pick up the Talanoa and take their place on the mat, or the Fala to continue in dialogue. And there's so many rich things that, I mean, I heard like 4 or 5 other panels pop up from what you all were sharing in particular. And I think some of the notes that I want to make, right, around lifting up around this, right? Again, there's nothing pono about militarization or militarism. To this demilitarization, we've been there before, we've done it. That where we're at in this place of both remembering that about ourselves and our people, and also that imagination forward. Like, what are the things that we co-create with each other? And then this other piece around API, this like perennial and existential 2P or not 2P question of what I was sharing with Terisa is, as a highly relational, all of the ways that this visceral reaction to AAPI is that it's a misnaming of our relationship. It's a misnaming of how we connect. And so the importance of a panel on race, gender, and militarism is how it also states like empire is actually not the ways that we met each other. That so much of our cosmology and our stories actually tell about our connection being different, right? That our connection, meeting each other lifetimes over in different ways. And so though empire is the way that we know each other now, it cannot be the way that we choose to connect. That we actually have an opportunity to connect in liberation and in freedom. And so really loving the offering too of like, this way until freedom. This way until freedom. And so much of what you all offered was like this way towards freedom. And so I hope what people leave with, what people carry, what our people are warmed by, is the brilliance that we were offered so many different pathways to get free, And I hope what you heard was an invitation to freedom, even if it felt like a challenge. So thank you so much to our brilliant, wonderful, gracious panelists for being so generous with your time and your spirit and your energy. Thank you to everybody who's tuning in. And I hope this means that you are going to get to take some time for rest and care. All right. Take care, everyone. Good night.